We're talking about getting geared up for the 2026 legislative session here in Utah. And education is often, in fact, I think always, a really high profile issue for legislators. And we're going to dive into a lot of what's being proposed already as the session is right around the corner. To have this conversation, I'm excited to welcome into our virtual studio, back to the show, Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland. Christine, welcome back.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Christine, you wrote recently for the Sutherland Insights blog a really good explainer piece kind of profiling some of the education bills that are already slated to be discussed during the session this year. And I want to start with maybe what do you think are the main themes? Like if you're just sort of giving someone an overview of when it comes to education policy in the session for 2026 in Utah, what are the key high-profile issues or topics that they're going to be discussing?
Yeah, like you mentioned, education is the one of the areas that has the most bills that you'll see listed online. It also is the big ticket item, the biggest price tag usually for the state. So there's just a lot going on, and it's kind of hard to consolidate sometimes what the themes are. But here's my best summary that we see so far. I would say technology and education is going to be a big one. There is this proposal to ban cell phones from bell to bell. So last year, we saw that the legislature banned phones during class time, right? So when there's actual instruction, but this would go further than that, right? So not even in the hallways, not in home classroom or the extra periods where they don't have instruction time and things like that. So it's the full day. This is something that's listed on the House priorities page. The governor of Utah has spent a lot of time also strongly advocating for this and saying this is, the next step. And if Utah were to do this, they would be the first state to move in this direction. And that's actually really noteworthy. Utah is this state that is so pro technology. We invite a lot of those businesses to the state. We're at the cutting edge of the AI discussion, but also leading out on how do we protect our kids. So it's a really unique kind of niche that Utah has. And in a similar vein, there was a conference recently that looked at two other bills that would protect kids from technology. One is called the SAFE Act, and the other is called the Balance Act. And one sets a standard for approving software before it's used in class, and the other is to reduce unnecessary screen time. We understand that technology can be a really beneficial tool, but to make sure that it's not becoming kind of a crutch or something that we lean on too much, especially in the younger ages. So, kind of looking at that balance, those I'm sure will be really lively, interesting discussions because again, Utah does embrace technology. Um, there's even the state obviously has state standards, and digital literacy is one of those that kind of has strands and things you can go read online. But another legislator is proposing a digital literacy class or course as a requirement for graduation. And so I think that kind of just shows that, hey, we really want the students to understand the world they're living in. It tackles things like social media and AI in the world that these kids are already really just swimming in. So that would be a key one. Another would be literacy. There have been a lot of headlines about this, and this has been going on since, for a few years. But the NAEP scores of last year showed that while Utah's reading scores are a little bit above the national average, and that's typical, they're still down from the year before. They're down since COVID-19. And this is a national trend. Reading comprehension is down, and that's really concerning. Reading is how kids learn after about the third grade. Every kid's different, but that's kind of the rule of thumb there. And so as we see this slipping, that's a real big cause for concern. And again, this is something that the governor has really, shined a light on and is hoping to address. I know the legislature is also wanting to focus on this. So we see that chronic absenteeism, and sometimes I link these together because these are both issues that have worsened since COVID-19, right? Kids got into this habit of not going to school, and certainly being in class, sitting there and getting instruction from the teacher does have impacts on outcomes. And test performance and things like that. So there are a couple of bills that are working on data and chronic absenteeism. Um, Specifically beefing up like an attendance tracking, having tiered interventions, and annually looking at how those improve, and then also requiring the state board to aggregate data and share that. So, um, chronic absenteeism is like this is not a new thing. The legislature's been working on this for years, but I think everyone's still just trying to really narrow in on the root causes. How do we improve it? And there's always this concern, and I think it's completely valid about the volume of education bills, right? There's a lot of discussion about how do you expect districts and schools to comply if there's just an avalanche of requirements every year. But I will say that chronic absenteeism and reading are things that I believe do need public policy support and are worthy of consideration and moving in that direction. The final that I would say in the K-12 space, as always, would be kind of education choice. So the big Utah fits all scholarship debate is now in the courts, but that hasn't stopped legislators from kind of legislating in the space. I would say in less intense ways, but in particular, you see a couple of different bills that are seeking to decouple the scholarship from teacher salary. So if you remember, that was the really important compromise that the governor wanted to see before he would sign the education choice bill. It wasn't there were plenty of people that weren't a fan of that, and so these bills are trying to separate the two. One in particular just says it doesn't need to be attached to the operation of this program at all, and the other says, if litigation were to effectively get rid of the program, it doesn't impact the salary. Um, so, those would be important. I think the other piece that I've been writing a lot about, if anyone's following Sutherland's work on education, is open enrollment. So often we focus on education choice as these programs, vouchers, tax credit scholarships. Those are very important. They've been nationally very splashy, and we've taken the time in Utah to debate them. But there are public choice options that are really important, like open enrollment, which is that you can transfer your kid between one district school to another district school. And just diving in and looking at this issue, we realize there's plenty of space for reform. A lot of the districts aren't sharing the data that's required by law. That data is useful for parents that are trying to understand if there's space available. It's useful for policymakers who are trying to see trends. And so, a recommendation that Sutherland is really advancing is making sure that there's a state level reporting requirement. So, specifically, that means that the State Board of Education would get this data from the LEAs or the districts and would aggregate it and host it on their data center, which has a lot of other information already: attendance, test scores, things like that. So it would make a lot of sense just to include that. So I would say those: technology, reading, choice. One other I will just put in, I know this will continue to be a discussion, especially after the horrific shooting this year at UVU. Um, Campus safety, school safety. There's a couple of bills aimed at assessing risk for public speakers at universities and things like that. So there's definitely a lot going on in the higher ed space. I typically focus on K-12, but safety will also be a big one.
Christine, that's a great overview. So thank you for kind of giving us the landscape. I want to follow up on a couple of those because you touched on some interesting aspects of these debates. And one on technology in schools, it seems to me that issue can often be framed as kind of either or. There was, I would say, within the last 10 years or so, there's kind of been a rush for being pro-technology and putting devices in schools. I know there's been debate at times about iPads or Chromebooks or things like that as resources for students in classrooms or at home. So there's a sort of a track record of, we recognize that technology can be an asset, but then now with these conversations about maybe limiting some of that in the classroom, sometimes I hear other people kind of frame big tech as sort of the bad guys or the enemy, and setting aside maybe some of the nuanced debates that are valid to have there, is it fair to say that this kind of approach is Utah sort of leading out in a way to find the balance between how can we leverage technology in a way that's productive, but balance it with minimizing distractions or harm, especially to kids? Seems like all these new technological advancements, we're still figuring out how to get the benefits and minimize the negatives as a society. Are some of these bills sort of a step in that direction in your mind?
I think they are. Here's the key that I think whenever I think of technology and education, the biggest pitfall is when something is promoted as a um, silver bullet, so to speak, right? That this will fix everything if we could just get devices in the classroom. If we could just get this one, this one unique thing in the classroom. Um, those have almost never panned out, right? It takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of understanding, and there's also downsides and risk, student privacy of data. So a lot of things come up. And so I think it's just a natural thing to have bills that come out and kind of temper some of these trends. And I don't think typically that policy is super linear, that we just chart the path, we know exactly where we're going, but sometimes it's a little bit of a pendulum swing. We embrace this, we see the problems, so we, put forward bills like we are this year. Um, and so I think, though, that Utah is uniquely positioned to strike the right balance. We're a little bit less afraid of bringing together opposing ideas. We're not so in the zero sum mentality. So I do have a lot of hope that we'll get it right. We want to embrace whatever power and potential that technology has, but we're also pretty aware that it has its limitations and its risks. So it'll be really interesting to see where this lands.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.